the free bikes were provided to people to use it. And when you put the two things together, safe space, free bikes, you've got huge uptick in activity and sustained activity. The return on investment is at least £12 for every £1 spent.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmer, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So Mark, what are we covering today?
Hello Christian, and hello to our listeners. A little later in this episode, you have an encounter with an Olympic legend talking about cycling. But before that, we're going to look at the UK government's Railways Bill, which has recently been published and which implements Labour's pledges on the reform of the railways.
So Mark, you've been looking through this with all its 93 clauses. You've been looking at the backup papers and everything else. And obviously, we're not going to have time to go through it in enormous detail, but, give us a few headline thoughts about the bill and whether it was what you expected and how you see it proceeding from here.
Yes, I'll try to do that, Christian, because we could easily get lost in the weeds of the many clauses and schedules of this long piece of legislation, which was published at the same time as the government published its response to the big consultation undertaken at the beginning of this year on possible rail reform, to which there were thousands of responses from all sorts of industry parties, consumer groups and representatives, and many individual members of the public. So the two things came out together on the 5th of November. But what I'm going to try to do in our discussion today is concentrate on the bill itself and what it tells us about the UK government's direction of travel.
So despite the 5th of November, no explosions in it?
No, but a few surprises,
right.
you might say. And one of them, which loyal listeners will be familiar with from our examination of the Conservatives' previous attempt at rail reform until they were defeated in the general election of 2024, is that you may recall that the previous government's draft rail reform bill, although it was aimed at setting up something called Great British Railways, didn't actually mention Great British Railways. It instead envisaged the creation of something called an integrated rail body, which would then magically transform itself into Great British Railways later on in the process.
But this has a resonance with the Railways Bill of 1993, which didn't mention rail track.
Indeed. There's always been this idea that somehow you can't explicitly talk about the institution that you're creating. Well, in the Labour government's Railways Bill that's just been published, Great British Railways does feature explicitly in the name as the name of the organisation primarily being created as a result of this legislation. So it does actually show that what you can do if you put your mind to it with something like this. But perhaps more significantly than just that labelling of the organisation is the fact that, in common with the Conservatives' proposals, Great British Railways will be built out from primarily Network Rail Infrastructure Limited. So Network Rail Infrastructure Limited and its 40,000 or so employees become the bedrock of the new organisation. And that's something which there's been a lot of debate about really ever since rail reform began under the Conservatives. The argument as to whether GBR should be a completely new organisation or something built from Network Rail. And even quite recently, Christian, you were writing about something that was known as the twin engine approach, whereby somehow in GBR you would have two separate but cooperating organisations, one made up of the rail operating business and one of the infrastructure business. But that now seems to have been pushed to one side, and they've gone for this Network Rail based solution.
Well, the concern amongst some people in the industry there is that this will be an engineering organisation, focusing on the engineering, on the repairs and the maintenance, and they'll forget about the operators. And is that something you think is a concern?
And forget about the passengers.
Yes, absolutely.
Of course, which is the crucial point. Now, in the accompanying document, so the weighty tome in which the government responds to the consultation, they go out of their way to say that this won't happen, that there will be cultural change. And they say that the basing GBR on Network Rail is a kind of administrative convenience.
Peter Henry gave me that argument at various points in this process.
Yes, and that it avoids the inconvenience of cost of shifting 40,000 people out of one organisation and into another. However, I think there will still be, across many parts of the industry and the user community for the passenger railway, concerns about exactly what you're describing and whether that cultural change will occur. It'll also feed into maybe concerns or certainly issues around the location of the headquarters of GBR.
Is this not Derby?
Well, of course, there is a pledge made by the previous government and this one that Great British Railways will be headquartered in Derby. But it strikes me that that's kind of easier to achieve with a new organisation than one which has many thousands of people based at existing centres of power.
You can't move Milton Keynes to Derby and all those staff.
No.
There just aren't the buildings there for it.
Well, and they talk in the documentation. They talk about centres such as Milton Keynes and York and Manchester and Birmingham continuing to be very important administrative hubs. But one does wonder how many people will actually be moving to Derby. And I would think that during the passage of the bill, Derby's representatives and lobbyists are going to be making a very strong case for the maximum possible shift to Derby by the GBR organisation.
Okay, so we're going to have an organisation called Great British Railways. It's going to be sort of in Derby. What else do we know from this weighty bill?
Well, the next thing I'd like to turn to is something that features in the legislation on the face of the bill, which is something called the long-term rail plan. So there's going to be one, and I think that is in itself a significant development.
But isn't this just the control period that Network Rail operated on?
No, it's more than that. It's more than that. So there are a lot of references to the control period process and how that will continue in a modified form under the new GBR structure. So some listeners may know that essentially Network Rail's spending plans are determined on a 5-yearly basis known as a control period, which is a kind of complex negotiation, almost a dance between Network Rail, the government, the Scottish government, importantly, and the Office of Rail and Road to determine what a fair level of taxpayer support for Network Rail is, and also a fair level of access charges being paid by the operators. Now, of course, with most of the operators being in the public sector, and with the government taking a much more direct role in controlling Great British Railways, the rail industry in its entirety, that process needs to change. But in addition to that, there's going to be this long-term rail plan.
Oh, so it's an addition. So there's going to be both these things.
Both of these things. So what the bill actually says about the long-term rail plan is, in fact, it's called the Rail Strategy. And the Secretary of State must prepare and publish a document that sets out the Secretary of State's long-term strategy for the development and use of the railway network in Great Britain and the railway services that the Secretary of State wishes to see provided in Great Britain. And the Secretary of State has to keep that strategy under review may also revise and replace it, which is a bit of a trapdoor potentially, should there be a change of government. And there's extensive provision for consultation on this long-term rail strategy with the devolved administrations, so Scotland and Wales in particular.
When we're talking long term, do we know what does that mean?
So the bill and indeed the explanatory notes are silent on the length of the long-term strategy. And I can imagine that's an issue that would be picked up by campaigning groups and parliamentarians as the bill goes through. You may recall, listeners may recall, that the previous government was developing a 30-year strategy for the railways, which never actually saw the light of day during the extensive and lengthy rail reform process under the Conservatives. My hunch would be that Labour might be working on a rather shorter horizon, perhaps of 10 years, for their strategy.
And do you think this will set out, say, we want a high-speed rail line between here and there, or we want kind of to revamp the main line between here and there, or what? I mean, is that the sort of thing you want to be?
Well, it's an interesting point to speculate on, Christian, because in fact the bill, the response to the consultation and the explanatory notes, as far as I can see, don't mention high speed 2 at all, let alone any services that might actually operate on them. So of course this may be in the detail of the strategy and all the work and consultation around it which eventually emerges.
Okay, so what else have we got in this enormous bill?
So of course this is the second major piece of legislation that the Labour government has introduced affecting the railways. The first last year, which was rushed through at amazing speed, was the bill to enable the return to public ownership of the franchised train operations in England, or those franchises that were based in England. Of course, that's being implemented progressively every couple of months, and other train
operators. We've had Greater Anglia recently, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is all ongoing. So what that also then triggers is a big change to the way that access to the railways is going to be managed, because Great British Railways will be responsible for providing access to its own network for its own services, which is different from the horizontally separated railway we've had for the last 30 years ago, whereby Network Rail was a kind of neutral provider of access to services that were owned and operated by other organisations. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, because of course there will be continued operation of trains that are not part of Great British Railways. So for example, ScotRail and Caledonian Sleeper that are under the control of the Scottish Government, Transport for Wales rail services under the control of the Welsh Government, London Overground services and Elizabeth Line services in and around the capital, Merseyrail electrics, and of course
the open
access operators, which is it has always been one of the most controversial aspects to this reform process, previously under the Conservatives and now under Labour. And Labour's blown hot and cold over open access. So when Labour came to power and Louise Haigh was the Transport Secretary, perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, Louise Haigh was a big enthusiast.
Let a thousand flowers bloom.
Indeed.
Yes.
And of course, in the early days of the Labour government, some big rolling stock orders were announced on the back of anticipated new open access
by
operations.
First Group and others.
That's right, big ceremonies at the factories and so on, involving ministers. Now it appears that although there are some warm words about the continuation of competition, when you look in the detail of what's being said in the response to the consultation, to me it gave the distinct impression that the government sees open access as continuing while the licences are currently in place, but eventually open access will wither away and become a fringe activity. So that's a really, really important point, and I think probably going to be one of the main battlegrounds on the bill as it works its way through Parliament. And surprisingly, perhaps not just in the House of Lords, because there are many communities, many of them nowadays represented by Labour MPs, who feel that they benefit from open access services and wouldn't otherwise be served by the regular train operators.
Well, as I understand it, I mean, they're not going to go and try and end Hull Trains or Grand Central. But as I understand it, the big difference is going to be that it will no longer be up to the Office of Road and Rail to decide who will have open access services, but rather it will be up to Great British Railways. Yeah. And the appeal body will be the Office of Road and Rail. So one would imagine that Great British Railways, which wants to be in charge of most of the lines and the timetable and whatever, will actually turn down a lot of these applications. And then they'll have to appeal, but they'll only be able to appeal on the grounds of what is the policy that has been set. So they won't be able to say, well, you know, we think that there's train paths available, whatever. They'll be able to appeal on the basis of, you know, the fact that Great British Railways will have a set policy about this, and only if they've disobeyed that policy will they get a successful appeal. So I think it's a pretty narrow scope for the open access operators.
Yes, and of course access doesn't just apply to the passenger railway either, because freight operators have to apply for access to the network on a similar basis to the open access operators.
So do you have any feeling about what our friends in the freight industry feel about this?
Well, I think you can see the effects of their lobbying on the bill and on the explanatory notes, in that there is going to be a pretty heavy obligation on the Secretary of State and GBR to grow rail freight.
Right.
So they can only do that if they grant the paths and the capacity at the times that the freight operators need to run in order to grow their businesses. But having said that, I still think the tone of the documentation, it does say on a number of occasions the network is very busy, the network is very full. Some assets are operating at capacity. So I think there are going to be ongoing pressures around this, and I would expect the rail freight lobby to look for even stronger assurances on the face of the bill and spoken by ministers as the bill makes its way through Parliament.
One of the things that the public really cares about, of course, are fares and ticketing and the like. What's the bill saying about that?
Well, in the sort of explanatory notes, one of the things that's criticised about the present structure of the rail industry is the multiplicity and complexity of fares and the possibility of having so many different fares between two locations. And there's a desire to simplify that. Now, we know that's going to be achieved in part through the amalgamation of all of the existing ticketing platforms of the train operating companies that have been brought back into public ownership. So there's going to be a kind of GBR platform for ticketing, which is going to be a hell of a big beast and have enormous market power. There's provision for Wales and Scotland, London to continue to have their own ticketing systems. And there are warm words about the competition from the third party retailers. Probably warmer words about those than there are about the open access operators that are in a similar position. But that's from the perspective of the third party retailers, is kind of an improvement on where they were quite recently with Labour, and also, of course, where they were in the early days of the Conservative.
Yes, when they were going to wipe them all out and have all tickets sold via GBI. It was an amazing piece of Stalinist legislation that come from a Conservative government.
That's right.
I mean, I'm all in favour of that, but then I'm an old Stalinist. So, what do you think we're going to end up with? Some sort of hybrid system?
Well, I think this is one of those cases where, as the bill makes its way through Parliament, the third-party retailers will be wanting as many assurances as they can get written into the legislation or uttered by ministers to enable them to be able to say to their investors, look, we have a long-term future in the rail industry in Great Britain. But I think there's also, very importantly, the consumer interest in all of this, because it's all very well simplifying fares, but at what level are you going to simplify the fares? Is it, for example, if there are 10 different fares between two stations, is the harmonised fare the highest one, which might well be what the Treasury is looking for, rather than necessarily what's in the consumer interest? And related to that, there's a whole new provision in the bill for setting up a new passenger watchdog.
Right, which is not going to be transport focused. It's going to be taken away from transport.
Well, it kind of is. It kind of is.
Okay.
It looks like it's a bit confusing. It looks like it's going to be sort of taken out of transport focus, but then given back to them again. Right. And that's all a bit confusing, because transport focus, although it was originally primarily a rail organisation,
it was rail.
Rail Passengers Committee,
right,
I think was its original.
Well, in the old days, yes. There was
now
Train Users Consultative Committees. You're old enough to remember this.
Well, indeed, yes. And it's gone through several kind of iterations and evolutions, and now deals with trams and buses and roads, all sorts of a whole variety of consumer protection issues. So I'm not sure we're entirely clear yet about how this reform sits, and just what additional safeguards are going to exist for rail passengers.
So of course another key aspect which in the run-up to the legislation the Labour government has given a lot of emphasis to is devolution, but I always think there's a bit of a contradiction there, because they want both devolution but they also want kind of the heavy hand of the state to control things. So how have they squared that little equation?
Well, I think it's just worth reflecting, Christian, on the fact that when the railways were privatised in the 1990s, there was no devolution. So there was no Scottish Parliament, there was no Senedd in Wales, there were no directly elected mayors in London or anywhere else when the railway's present structure was set up. And then incrementally over the last 30 years, or since the turn of the century, the setting up of these new institutions has brought with it various degrees of powers over the rail system. At its most highly developed form in the case of Scotland, where there is full devolution over most infrastructure investment decisions, and they have their own funding settlement for Network Rail. There's a sort of halfway house in Wales, where there's a lot of influence over the passenger services, less over the infrastructure, and then various deals in London and the other cities around their powers, duties and obligations. So what this bill tries to do is kind of wrap all that up, bring it up to date, and reflect the reality of the current situation. But I think there's going to be a lot of incremental discussion around this as well, with some of the national and city region leaders looking to acquire more powers, and with that more money and more control and influence over the system in their areas.
Yes, because there's not just the big local mayors like I don't know, London and Manchester and whatever, but there's also, like for example where you live, there's a mayor for Cambridgeshire.
We have a metro mayor for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough.
And so you know, will they expect to get some devolved powers over the railways? But you can't really quite see how that would work.
No, there are all sorts of shades of grey in between this, and of course local government reform in England, which is going on in parallel, means that we'll have even more metropolitan combined authorities with directly elected mayors within a couple of years. So there's a further complexity to this. At the same time, so you've got this sort of, in a sense, there's these pressures that kind of pulling the railway apart to reflect local needs, at the same time as they're trying to put the railway back together as a vertically integrated and nationally controlled body. And you do wonder if at some point there's going to be a kind of a schism here.
I've always thought that there was a tension between those two. But anyway, well, thank you very much for that, Mark. That's some been a great analysis. And where can people find out more?
Well, what we should say is that the bill itself, although it's been published, right now as we speak, doesn't have a date for its first big debate in Parliament, but that will probably take place during the month of November. And from then on, if you would like further information, if you go to the website of my company, Cockitamus Limited, we have on there a flow chart that tries to explain in the simplest possible way the various stages that the bill will go through, all the way to finally being approved by the King, probably next summer. So do have a look at that, and do get in touch with Christian and myself if you'd like any further information.
Thank you, Mark.
We've been talking about Parliament and legislation. Well, Christian was in Parliament recently meeting Olympic cycling legend Chris Boardman, who's also the chair of Active Travel England, at the launch of a publication promoting a scheme to make bicycles more easily available to people on lower incomes, and with the opportunities that could potentially bring to them. And here's Christian's discussion with Chris.
I'm at the House of Lords, where I've just been to the launch of a pamphlet around a fantastic scheme that is about giving free bikes to poorer people in the community, which gets them active and which enables people to get around free, and really kind of is a very liberating experience. And I'm with Chris Boardman, who's the chair of Active Travel England, which supports the scheme, and was here at the launch. So, Chris, tell me a little bit about what exactly these schemes are about. Well, I first came across this about 8 years ago when I was participating in a mass participation event in Birmingham, totally for my own leisure. And I came across, just running back into Birmingham, a group of Muslim women riding along in burqas, on these orange bikes, having a great time, having a laugh. And I thought, that's interesting. What is that? And I found out a little bit more about it. And a local councillor told me about it. And he said, yeah, we're giving away 8,000 bikes in Birmingham. And we give them away and they're tracked. And the only condition is they have to be used. They sit in the garage, we'll take them back, give them back to somebody else. And not only that, we'll train people, teach them about mechanics, and we will focus in on the people that need it most. The postcodes where we've got deprived communities where people can't afford bikes, and we'll give them access to work, to health, activity with their kids. And it was amazing. And I said, wow, this looks incredible. This really is very progressive. Does it work? And he said, yeah, it's great. And I thought, oh, is that it? Have we got anything more empirical? And then over the years, I've seen it and I've visited schemes. I became chairman of Sport England. We fund this activity in Birmingham, another place in Essex, and other places in the country.
Active Travel England
for Sport England.
For Sport England.
So I come across it again as chair of Active Travel England, where in Jaywick Sands, a really deprived area of Essex, where the Department for Transport via Active Travel England essentially created safe space tarmac linking local communities, and the free bikes were provided to people to use it. And when you put the two things together, safe space, free bikes, you got huge uptick in activity and sustained activity amongst groups that needed it.
Which is measurable. This report that came out at this launch measured this.
And the report that came out today was a very robust study using Treasury's Department for Transport's metrics, really carefully and conservatively done, that showed the return on investment is at least £12 for every £1 spent. So in the transport world, where you're expecting 2 to 1 is deemed really good.
With HS2, I think it's less than that.
Well, I think HS2 is in negatives, but this is almost unheard of in transport terms. So being the chair of both of those organisations, I'm thinking, wow, we put this together and you have got a way to change a country's behaviour and its health.
But how do you scale it up? Because the report was really about 3 schemes in Essex, in Birmingham, and in London, Southall. How do you go from that into something much bigger?
Well, That's the beauty of having a national organisation whose ethos is to enable rather than to lead. And so, locally designed, nationally led. So you've got local schemes like this that have proved a concept. We have a network of 50 and growing active partnerships in local communities. We liaise with over 60 national governing bodies of sport. We have a network already to use to do this, and we can then enable it, and we can spread that best practice around the country. We can mix it in with transport. So I have a really good working relationship with all of the metro mayors in England, who to get combined represent a third of the population, 20 million people. And when you go, right, if you're going to do safe space around schools for travel, link in with this scheme to activate that safe space that you're making, and suddenly it really works. So hopefully we can bring national and local together in that way.
But the trouble with Chris, I mean, I'm an old hand like you. This is a fantastic idea. I mean, 12 to 1 and all that is absolutely amazing kind of return. But, I could just see the kind of politicians and the councillors saying, oh, yeah, it's all great, but we don't have any money or anything. How do you get around that?
Well, we do have money. So Sport England would typically fund this kind of activity. And we are currently in the process of really refocusing what we do. So we've been out into communities, we've enabled people, and we haven't told them what to do. We've explored. And this is the kind of thing that's come out after 4 years of doing that said, actually, this one really works. So we're designing a return on investment framework now that will allow us to go, these are the things that really work across the country, and we will do more of it. So the cash is actually there. We invest about 220 million a year in activities like this. So when you have the proof points and the network to deliver it, suddenly we can make it work.
So we can expect to see more of these schemes kind of around the country sponsored by you?
I think we can definitely expect to see more schemes around the country like this. Now we've got that evidence, that data. And don't forget, we've got devolution now. So we've got all of those 14 metro mayors have devolved transport and health budgets where you've given them evidence that says this works. And we have a way to communicate that via Sport England. So, I think through various funding streams, we will see a lot more of this now.
I just want to ask one point about the scheme itself. I mean, these are orange bikes. They're noticeable. Would they be stigmatized at all? I mean, would that be people be embarrassed riding around one of these bikes, or do they look good?
I don't think there's a stipulation on the colour. I think that's where it started, and you've given a scheme, an identity, as it were. And the label we attach to that identity depends how we sell it, how we market it. I'd like to think it could be quite cool.
And is it mainly kids' bikes, or is it for grown-ups, or both?
It's predominantly adults, and we're finding that the uptake is predominantly women as well. So all of the data around it, and it's really rich data, says it's reaching everybody that you want the most. And it is kids' bikes as well, and it's training, and it's maintenance. So it's a full wraparound package.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. That's a great summary of it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, there was this terrible incident that I'm sure everybody knows about on the railways about 10 days ago, when several people were attacked by a person with a knife. And it was on a train that was going, oddly enough, from Doncaster to London, and it just left Peterborough, and this attack started. And several people have been badly hurt. They're now all out of hospital, apart from one, who I will mention in a minute. But what was quite remarkable and heartening was both what happened in the immediate aftermath, and also the resulting coverage for the railway. So what happened was quite amazing, that people started knocking on the driver's door, calling for help and saying that there had been people stabbing, and the driver had the quick-wittedness, who is called Andrew Johnson, had the quick-witted reaction to call control and spoke to a guy called Rob Pape, who is the signaller, who then diverted the train from the fast lane, where there is no platform at Huntingdon, to the slow lane, which does have a platform at Huntingdon, and therefore enabled the train to stop by the platform, by which time the police had arrived, and got on the train and very quickly arrested the guy, and of course all the paramedics were there. And the story that emerged was that one of the customer hosts, a guy called Samir Zatumi, who'd worked for the LNER for 20 years, absolutely behaved heroically by trying to apprehend the person doing the stabbing, getting badly stabbed himself, but preventing undoubtedly lots of other injuries. And fortunately, although he's been badly hurt, we've just heard that he has been woken from his coma and seems to be on the mend. And the railways rightly have had a lot of good coverage about this, showing both the importance of having trained staff on board, of practicing for these sort of events, of railway people being very quick to react, and also the very fact that the whole railway community came together so quickly. The emergency services arrived, the ambulances arrived, and the whole thing was brilliantly handled, and rightly so. The railways have had good publicity out of what was an awful, terrible incident.
Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on social media channels, including Blue Sky, Facebook, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle on X is @AllStationsPod.